Hello and welcome back. In the last video, I talked about Microsoft's three-pronged approach to the cloud. There's the on-premises environment, which can be configured as private cloud or hybrid cloud. There's Office 365 and Microsoft Azure. And throughout the rest of this video series, we're going to be working with all of that, plus Intune. So there's going to be a lot of moving parts in our lab environment. So that being the case, I thought that it might make sense to spend a little bit of time up front showing all of the pieces that we're going to use and how those pieces fit together. So let's go ahead and get started. So the diagram that you see on this slide represents the way that our on-premises network is going to be configured. Well, sort of. We're actually going to create two separate Active Directory forests. We're going to have a management forest, which is represented by these machines down here, and we're going to have a virtual machine forest, which you can see up here. Now I've got another slide that will show this in more detail, but let's talk about what we've got here for just a second. So the portion of this diagram that's labeled Management Network represents our management forest. The management forest is an Active Directory forest that we're going to be creating that is going to act as a low-level infrastructure component. That forest is going to consist of a domain controller that's running on physical hardware, and that domain controller isn't shown in this diagram. And we're going to have a number of Hyper-V servers that are clustered together by way of the Windows failover clustering service. Then, up here, we're going to have a virtual machine network. So this is going to represent an entirely separate Active Directory forest. And that Active Directory forest is going to contain all of the virtual machines. So if this were a production environment, then those virtual machines would be the servers that are running our business workloads. The management network just provides the infrastructure that makes it possible to run those virtual machines. Now, there is one more thing I need to point out about this diagram before we move on, and that is the way that the cluster storage is set up. What you see in the diagram represents a traditional failover cluster. Typically in a Windows failover cluster, the nodes, which are these Hyper-V servers, each connect to centralized storage. Typically, this is a storage array that the nodes connect to using either Fiber Channel or iSCSI. And that storage array is treated as a cluster shared volume. So it's storage that's connected to each one of the cluster nodes, hence the way the diagram is drawn. Well, we're going to be doing things just a little bit different than the way that the storage is depicted in the diagram. You see, when Microsoft released Windows Server 2016, they introduced a brand new feature called Storage Spaces Direct. Storage Spaces Direct allows you to configure Windows Server in a way that, at least on some level, mimics hyperconverged infrastructure. So in other words, each node within the cluster can have its own internal storage, and you can use that internal storage rather than having to use centralized storage for the cluster shared volume. So we're still going to have a cluster shared volume just as the diagram depicts. The difference is that each one of these nodes is going to have its own copy of the cluster shared volume. And the virtual machines are going to be hosted on that cluster shared volume and distributed across the Hyper-V nodes. So that's what our network is going to look like at a very high level. Let me pull up another slide and we'll take a more detailed look. So in this slide, we've got exactly the same thing that you saw on the previous slide with regard to our management network and our virtual machine network, but I've filled in just a little bit more detail. So for our management network, we're going to use a forest domain name of posymanagement.com. Posy being my last name, so I thought it made sense. Now, on the virtual machine network, we're going to call that one posylab.com. Now remember, posymanagement.com is going to correspond to an infrastructure network. The infrastructure network is going to consist of a number of servers running Windows Server 2016. We're going to have 3 Microsoft Hyper-V servers that are based on Windows Server 2016, hence the Server 2016 label right here by the mouse pointer and the Hyper-V logo just above it. We're also going to have a physical domain controller that's also running Windows Server 2016. And in one of the later videos, we're going to be deploying System Center Virtual Machine Manager. Now, Virtual Machine Manager is a tool that fits in with the Microsoft System Center suite, and it's primarily designed for managing Microsoft virtualization environments, namely Hyper-V. So that's what our management network is going to look like. Now, the virtual machine network is a little bit different. Remember, this is where our business workloads are going to run. Now, of course, this is a lab environment, so we're not actually going to be running production workloads. But if we were, they would run in the virtual machine network, which I'm calling posylab.com. So what are we going to be running in here? Well, we're going to have a number of virtual machines that are running Windows Server 2016, and at least a couple of those virtual machines are going to run Exchange Server 2016. So why Exchange? Well, let me flip to the next slide and I'll show you. So if you think back to the previous video, you'll recall that the whole reason why I'm creating these videos is to illustrate how to connect your on-premises network to Microsoft Cloud services such as Office 365 and Microsoft Azure. Well, one of the things that I talked about in that video is that Office 365 is the Microsoft Software as a Service cloud. And the actual software that you get varies depending on which subscription that you sign up for. But among the more core services that you're likely to get are things like the Microsoft Office applications, things like Outlook, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, OneNote, Access, Publisher, InfoPath. So those are the desktop software applications that you may get with Office 365 depending on which subscription you sign up for. But there are also server applications. So if you look at this last column right here where the mouse pointer is, we can see applications such as Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive for Business, and Lync. And in reality, there are many more. These are just kind of the core ones that everybody talks about. Well, I'm not going to take the time to talk about every single application in Microsoft Office 365 because there are a ton of applications, and to be quite frank, I could probably do an entire video series on each one by itself. But I do want to provide a representative sampling, and one of the main reasons why organizations tend to adopt Microsoft Office 365 is because of Exchange. Exchange is notorious for being difficult to configure and maintain, and so a lot of organizations get Office 365 as a way of migrating Exchange to the cloud and offloading some of the management and maintenance burden. So that's why we're going to be setting up Exchange Server on some of our virtual machines. I'm going to set up an on-premises Exchange Server deployment, and then we're going to tie that Exchange Server deployment into Office 365. So that's why we've got Exchange shown over here next to posylab.com. So what about Microsoft Azure? You can see it on the diagram over here off to the right, way off by itself. Well, as you might recall from the previous video series, Azure is Microsoft's infrastructure as a service cloud, meaning that you can use Azure to create infrastructure components that run in the public cloud. Within Azure, you can create things like databases, websites, even virtual machines. Now, like Office 365, there are way too many components within Azure to demonstrate all of them. So for the purposes of this video series, I'm going to be focusing on a couple of specific components, namely the Azure Active Directory, or Azure AD as it's often referred to, and Azure Virtual Machines. So we're going to set up an Azure environment in one of the later videos, and we're going to create virtual machines, and then we're going to set up a gateway that will tie the Azure environment in with the on-premises environment. Now, just to give you a heads up, we're not actually going to be able to communicate between an Azure virtual machine and an on-premise virtual machine. That is possible in real life, but for my lab environment, I've got a consumer-grade router that's going to limit what we can actually accomplish. We are going to be able to connect the gateway and prove that we've established connectivity between the two environments, but that's as far as we're going to be able to go. So it shouldn't be a big deal, but I wanted to give you a heads up front that that's the one limitation that we're going to encounter. So with that said, there is one other service that I'm going to be talking about in the very last lesson, and that's something called Microsoft Intune. Now, Intune isn't shown on the diagram, and the reason why I left it off is because it's considered to be a relatively minor component of the Microsoft Cloud infrastructure. So what is Intune? Well, if you think about the way that IT used to be, it used to be that organizations just had a bunch of PCs, and each one of those PCs were domain joined. Well, the problem is that today that's not necessarily the case. The PCs that are in an organization's local environment probably are domain joined, but PCs are no longer the only game in town. You also have users working from a variety of different tablets, smartphones, home PCs, and none of these devices are domain joined. So what Windows Intune does, or Microsoft Intune as it's come to be known more recently, is it provides a way of enrolling those devices into the Microsoft environment, so that way the administrative staff has at least some degree of control over those devices. So you can set policies, you can deploy apps to the devices, all through Intune. So we're going to spend a little bit of time in the very last lesson talking about how to tie Intune into all of this and how to use it to manage mobile devices. So as you can see, we've really got our work cut out for us. We've got a lot of moving pieces that are going to go into building out this infrastructure, and there's a lot for us to set up. So we'll get started with all that in the next video. I'll see you there.